But so I wanted to talk about, I think, a little bit more of what it has felt like on the ground to me to see the interplay between federal bioeconomy policy, how that translates to state actions, and how that also translates to, local municipal initiatives. So bioeconomy policy, there's been a very long history, as long as we've been doing bio-based research. We have been having policy related to that. So I'm just going to talk in a very specific timeline. So my post-TPP days, I finished TPP in 2019. And as Kristen said, that I was at Ginkgo for 4-ish years and then moved to the state a year and a half ago. So like 5-6 years window. But yeah, just to do a little bit of a deeper dive. So I graduated TPP 2019, went to Ginkgo, helped them figure out like what is government affairs, what do they want the government to do, and Ginkgo has a little bit of a unique business model, so got to take a really broad look at what does this ecosystem need, because Ginkgo has like 100 customers at a time. So if they do well, if the bioeconomy more broadly does well, then maybe Ginkgo itself could do well. So this is the moment that I got to graduate into. It's pretty fun moment, to be honest with you. There was kind of finally traction within the bioeconomy. And mostly what as Mark said, like it's really hard to define the bioeconomy, but it includes therapeutic products, but we've had traction in therapeutics for a long time. But we were starting to really see these other kinds of products succeed. Bioindustrials, foods, materials. So like Impossible Lunch in 2016, that's like a pretty early headline for them. They really came to popularity in like maybe 2019. That's when they went into Burger King. So like that's a pretty good metric of popularity. Bolt Threads, like it took them 6 or 7 years, but they like finally started making ties out of their spider silk. And then there was just like a lot of money happening. This was a different time in the economy. Ginkgo raised a Series D valued at $1 billion. But 33 other companies that same year raised $1 billion in actual dollars. And importantly for this conversation, there was also a lot of reporting on the fact that China and other countries were starting to really catch on to how important synthetic biology and non-therapeutic applications of biotech were going to be. So that's the moment I got to graduate into. And so I enter into the scene and I start to try to observe what's happening. What is this landscape going to look like? The first event that I'd say felt really significant was in October of 2019. So the first Trump administration, they hosted a summit on America's bioeconomy. Okay, so summits are like policy-wise, they're not doing anything, right? It's a conversation, but it is a really important signal for what the federal government thinks is going to matter. They've never had a summit with the word bioeconomy before. This wasn't even a really popular term until around this time. This helped to draw attention to it, but they were not thinking about biotech and non-therapeutic applications of biotech. The feds really were not doing that in a meaningful way. So it's a big deal that they had this meeting. They gathered leaders plenty from MIT, lots from around the country, and hosted this event. And there were rumors that I think are true. The Trump administration had planned to do more action. They lost the election shortly after this, but they didn't get around to actually doing more action, but they had planned to. The next big event that I saw, Senator Markey, home state senator, introduced a bill that passed the Bioeconomy R&D Act in 2021. So this bill said something that's very basic, but again, had not been said. Research into the bioeconomy matters, and we should do more of it. We should invest in it, and we should be coordinated when we do this. This is a bipartisan introduction. There were 4 senators, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. So that was like another, again, this is not a crazy piece of legislation. We just hadn't seen this before. So a nice signal. This one I was myself a little bit more involved in. So the National Defense Authorization Act, have y'all experienced the NDAA? Maybe not. Okay, so this bill, the NDAA, is the authorization that funds the military and also all DoD activities. So the biggest employer in the country, 3 million people, the military, everything we do related to DoD research, but also everything we do related to like DoD supply chains. It used to be called an absolute must-pass piece of legislation. There are no must-pass pieces of legislation anymore in America. I would say like anything can happen in Congress, but it has been one of the most consistently passed piece of legislation year over year. And so getting something in there is a big deal. You can get a lot of traction that way if you can articulate it as a national defense priority. So this, what we got included in 2021 in the FY22 version of this bill was establishing a National Security Commission on biotech. I think commissions are really interesting. They're kind of like executive orders, which is that meaning that the Constitution says nothing about commissions. Like they're not defined, that they're not a thing that is clearly laid out, but they can be really influential. They basically are, or like the government decides, like, we need a group of people to tell the government what to do in a situation, usually Congress. The first like really high profile one was after the 9/11 attack, and there was like a commission to, figure out who to yell at in the government, right, about that attack. And it led to all kinds of outcomes in the security administration. But in the economic development space, the tech space, there had been two that were really influential. One was on the National Security Commission on cyberspace. So this led to like literally hundreds of pieces of legislation getting introduced and passed in cybersecurity infrastructure and also just like cyber infrastructure. So that was actually a very big deal for that sector in the earlier 2000s. And then there was a National Security Commission on AI that was chaired by Eric Schmidt. This was like a much more like ritzy, high profile one. There was like galas and a lot of press, and they didn't do as much legislatively, but like it was a big deal that they were starting to talk to the government about AI, right? This was like one of the first meaningful conversations about what is AI, what are the risks, what are we doing here, what should we spend our money on? So we, a bunch of us were like, hey, we need this for biotech. We need this for the bioeconomy so that they can tell Congress what we know, which is like, there's a lot coming and you need to prioritize and you need to meaningfully invest. So that got included in 2021. We were thrilled about that. The fourth one that I saw in the first few years that I was working as an advocate for this sector, the Chips and Science Act. So like, obviously, I think probably all of us know this by now, biggest industrial policy investment in generations. Big focus on semiconductors and microelectronics, but the and science portion, as I think probably all in the MIT community know, huge deal. It included pretty substantial sections on the bioeconomy. It articulated a bioeconomy initiative. It included biotech and bioindustrials as priority sectors to invest the and science work in. The NSF, this is when NSF was establishing the T, right? NST, there's not a T in the name, but the technology director at NSF, they included the bioeconomy as one of the sectors that they need to care about. So that was a big win for this space too. And then lastly, culminating for this timeline in an executive order, you had Georgia Lagudis last year on this. So Georgia Lagudis, by the way, mostly single-handedly did this and this when she was at Senator Murphy's office. So she's a total badass. But this executive order and an MIT PhD in bioe, so very, very cool. This executive order, so again, executive orders are like whatever the president feels like saying or doing, and they can be extremely diverse. This executive order was like really clear. Biden's like, this sector matters, we need to spend more money, and there's all these other issues that come with this space that we need to figure out. So this is something that actually we had heard that the Trump administration was trying to work towards their own executive order. Biden got to it first, so they won that battle, but this was a really huge landmark. Okay, so what are these 5 things together? Like these were put together by different administrations, Republicans and Democrats, Congress and the feds. But there were some really key themes here that I laid out of like, okay, what are the feds telling us they are thinking about this space? Competitiveness. So I think, right or wrong, the number one thing that United States is like, we want to win at all things, right? And we certainly don't want China to win, and we don't want Russia to win, but we really want the US to win on everything. And there's a little bit of a zero-sum game, like if you're second, you're last, right? There's a culture of that in DC. And so they were articulating like, it's not just enough that like we do well and that we invest here, but also that we do the best of any country, because otherwise we're not going to get all the good downstream effects. If you're not first, you don't get to decide what the ethics that you imbue into this technology are. You don't get to decide like where the jobs are, where the infrastructure is. So competitiveness, top line, a big priority. Accelerating innovation. So like, okay, I talked about the fact that we have Impossible, we had Bolt Threads, we're seeing these other companies start to have these smaller products. It takes too long, right? Like in those cases, the R&D was 10 plus years, and that's too slow. So they knew that we need this to go faster. R&D is like I would say it's bipartisan-ish. It depends on when we're talking about, but for those pieces of legislation and executive action, like research and development, like it's generally pretty accepted that like you got to do more research if you're gonna accelerate innovation. Coordination and simplification of regulations, just like a quick like fun rant, fun only for me probably, but the biotech has been regulated since 1986 under the coordinated framework for the regulation of biotech. This was OSTP was like, okay, look, within biotech, there's three kinds of products. There are drugs, there are crops, and there are pesticides. Those are the only three things that they could think of that you could do with biotech. So they were like, if it's a drug, it goes to FDA. If it's a crop, it goes to USDA. And if it is a pesticide, it is going to go to EPA. The end. Not a perfect regulatory system. It didn't get updated until like 15 years later. And then since then, it's been updated every 10 or 5 years. But every time, the way that they do this regulation is they have to come up with, OSTP or others have to come up with the universe of products that you could maybe make with biotech and then include that on a list of which agency you should talk to about that. But there's a lot of ambiguity. I mean, as Mark was articulating with the description of the bioeconomy, like this is, you know, I think all those of us who are bought in that you can make almost anything biologically. And so it is a constant struggle. I would also say that from what I saw in industry, ambiguous regulation is worse than stringent regulation, right? Like the most regulated space that we can think of is probably drugs, right? Or vaccines, you know, therapeutics. That is a space where people continue to innovate over and over and over again because they can incorporate the costs of that regulatory timeline into their R&D and how they're going to price the product, right? They also can charge whatever they want because it's a drug, but they can operate in that highly regulated environment. What businesses can't do is operate when they have no freaking idea what the end of the road is going to look like. If they're going to have to go to USDA and FDA and EPA, which tons of businesses were facing that reality, like that is, and they don't know what the answer is going to be. They have no idea how to price that in, and they're not going to pursue a product like that. So this was also pretty bipartisan. We need to make this easier. Measuring the bioeconomy, like what is the bioeconomy? How do we know if it's even growing? How do we know if any of this is even working? Another key priority, workforce development and policy, like pretty much everything comes back to jobs at the end of the day. There was a special interest, like nobody's really caring about jobs for people like us who like honestly go to fancy institutions and get bachelor's or master's or PhDs. Like nobody cares. We're fine. But what we do care about is jobs for folks who like only get an associate's level training or who, you know, even, you know, do an 8-week program and then have a job in the bioeconomy. Like that is what's interesting politically because that's what's accessible for most Americans. Risks and benefits, I think that this is more of a democratic initiative, but you know, this stuff is scary. CRISPR babies was like 2017 or something. I don't know. It's something in this era, but like recent enough that people are like, yeah, we should probably figure this out, figure out ethics here. And then lastly, and this is where I'll spend the rest of the time, domestic biomanufacturing. So like, as I think we all know, domestic manufacturing is like been a topic since manufacturing got hollowed out in the US. Like that politicians, that is a huge issue for their reelection, right? Like, do people have access to accessible, high-paying, you know, reliable jobs? That is like huge for their reelections, and manufacturing had a big avenue for that. And then that's been gone for 20 years and so in such a meaningful way, declined for 20 years. So there was a lot of interest in like, hey, biomanufacturing, that's a type of manufacturing, but one where maybe we can compete a little bit better than like, we're not going to compete, I would argue, ever again in textiles, probably, right? We're not going to compete in like huge commodity items where you need to get it as cheap as possible, but we could compete in higher value, more precise, higher class items, perhaps. So domestic biomanufacturing was interesting for the feds. So yeah, gonna focus there. Okay, I'm gonna move to state. Should I get questions throughout? Does anyone have questions? Yeah. Yeah. So Ginkgo Bioworks, I worked there as like an engineer and then TPP and then went back for their policy stuff. This is a company that is based in Boston, MIT spun out, that they are a little bit hard to describe, especially the landscape for them has changed, but they are basically a contract research organization that has like really big aspirations in everything you can do with biology. And they were like the first synthetic biology company to have $1 billion valuation. They went public with that, everything's like been terrible for this entire sector in the last few years. So they are not valued at $1 billion anymore, but they work with companies like big ag companies, chemical companies, others who are like, maybe they can get a better version of their product or a product in their supply chain biologically. So primarily they engineer microbes to produce single molecules or proteins very efficiently in fermentation tanks. And so because their whole volume though is at scale, like they were mostly chemies who then like came to biology and they're like, why is biology so slow and annoying? And if we do it at scale, if we try 10,000 times to make the same strain that's going to make the same product, then we're more likely to have it work. And also the more scale that you do, the cheaper you can get this, and the more realistic it is to like have biotech R&D be affordable. So that was kind of their vision. And so because they had such a grand vision, they took a really broad view of like what policy should look like. Does that get at your question? Okay. All right. Okay. State. So as I mentioned, I work at a state agency that has a bizarre name. MassTech Collaborative is we're technically what's called a quasi-public. Because I'm in TPP, I'm going to explain this. Nowhere else would you care. But Massachusetts likes to have these quasi-public institutions that are like, they're public, they're publicly funded. I'm a state employee, but we also have a little bit of independence in different structures. We have a board of directors who govern money that we give out. We primarily exist to give out money. That's what economic development really means. We have that board of directors is like appointed by the governor, but they don't have to do what the governor says. And so there's like a little bit more separation and kind of de-risks investing for the government. And so the state really likes these in the economic development space. If you're familiar with like Mass Clean Energy Center or Mass Life Sciences Center or Mass Ventures, if any of you are thinking about making your own startup, we have a bunch of these. And so MassTech, we've been around since the 80s, and we actually kind of do like a huge variety of things. We have a whole division dedicated to broadband. So like, and they also literally lay cable for internet access around the state. We have a division focused on cybersecurity, and then I lead our Center for Advanced Manufacturing, which is one of our divisions. So with that, I'm going to take a step up from the bioeconomy and biomanufacturing and talk about manufacturing in the state of Massachusetts for a minute. So as may have been clear with my career, I was like all biotech, and then I suddenly was in a broad manufacturing role when I came to the state. So there's a lot of stuff I did not know, even though I grew up in Massachusetts and lived here most of my life. Mass has 6,000 manufacturing organizations. I think that number surprises a lot of people. 5,000 of them have 50 or fewer employees. And actually in the US, like that is what manufacturing looks like. It's like tons and tons of tiny machine shops making really specific parts for really specific purposes. Massachusetts has 6,000 of these. So it's a pretty big portion of our economy. We have pretty remarkable advanced manufacturing prowess for a couple of reasons. Again, we're like the US, like we're not the place. Massachusetts is not big enough. We don't have a big enough, we don't have cheap enough land to like be the place to make massive components or to make things that have to be like as cheap as possible. Like our labor and our land are too expensive for that. But in cases where you need to be precise, where you need to have like really advanced specifications for parts and components that you're making, like you really can't do better than Mass. This is partly because of the defense industrial base. So as folks may know, Raytheon was headquartered here for like 50 years. They're now headquartered in Virginia, but they still have a huge base here. And then General Dynamics is based in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And so these defense primes, they get billions and billions and billions of dollars from the Department of Defense to make enormous things like rockets, right? And then there are thousands of components, and they need thousands and thousands of suppliers of those components. And it helps them to work locally because they can like go to the shop floor, they can like have conversations in person, they can yell at their suppliers in person, happens all the time. And so because of that, Massachusetts has like tons of these manufacturers. We also helped invent a lot of really advanced manufacturing techniques, like Lowell, Massachusetts, like there was some IP that was literally stolen by an American revolutionary from the Brits, like stole IP, came to Lowell, and then he really advanced textile production methods, including this system called roll-to-roll manufacturing, which is what it sounds like. It's like the fabric is on a roll, and then you have a stretched out piece, and then you process it on that step and then you roll it up again. It makes it very compact and efficient, and there's like much easier quality control. And so we did textile manufacturing for a long time. We don't really do that now, but it's being applied to all these other new advanced materials. Like I just the other day met with a company that is making flexible solar cells, and like they're using roll-to-roll manufacturing, which Massachusetts helped invent. This is not a surprise to MIT folks. Unparalleled academic research that feeds into the ecosystem. MIT, WPI, UMass Lowell, like really incredible research into manufacturing techniques. And I think what's really important is not every area in the US or the world that has like amazing academic research has a culture of commercialization. I would argue that we do have that in Mass. Like that is so normalized here that like PIs are not doing research just to do research. Like they want to see their products get out into the world. And then lastly, like one other just like high level comment on manufacturing here. So hard tech, by this I mean like physical products that include really advanced technologies, right? Cutting edge tech, like you could call this deep tech, to like the advanced physical products. There's an interesting kind of story here in Massachusetts where we're like one of the very top in the nation for SBIR funding, STTR funding. I think we're the highest VC per capita, or like the second after California overall. But these companies are doing really, really well. We're seeing huge progress. Companies like Go to the Engine, for instance, and then they're doing great. As soon as they start to think about manufacturing, they get courted by other states. I am not exaggerating when I meet founders all the time who are like the governor of South Carolina called them. It's like, have you thought about putting your manufacturing in South Carolina? And they get courted there. Massachusetts, we're not the cheapest place. And so we're seeing a lot of attrition at that moment. And so for a while, the state in manufacturing and hard tech in general, there's an opportunity here. And there's especially, I would argue, an opportunity at the pilot scale. So like pilot scale is not a super precise term, but like when you have your product working at the bench and you want to make enough of that product to get to the next phase, like your customer trials, clinical trials, field trials, whatever it might be, where like you don't know that it's going to work. You don't want to make a huge amount of it, but you need to make enough routinely for a year or two. Like that's pilot scale, and that's something that Massachusetts, I would argue, we have like a real value proposition there because you want it to be close to R&D. Okay, so that was my like manufacturing in Massachusetts in general. So as a reminder, like this is where I kind of left federal focus work. And so in 2022, that EO had come out, and all of this kind of downstream funding out of the CHIPS Act and the R&D Act started to come through. So I think the question that we were thinking about is like, how should the state of Massachusetts respond? So in July of 2023, MassTech, we're a state agency, so like people have to tell us what we're allowed to do, right? As you can imagine. We had to be told that we are allowed to prioritize bioindustrial manufacturing. That was a big deal for us. And it was a big enough deal that they hired me actually to come on because they had nobody knew what that was at the agency. And they're like, let's hire someone who cares about this. So what did that mean? Doing a deeper dive for like what this landscape looks like specifically, not just like the overall manufacturing, but what does the landscape of bioindustrial manufacturing look like in Mass? So again, R&D leader, like undebatable, a strong base of industrial application developers. So like Ginkgo, Robigo is an interesting company out of Worcester, Cersei, Motif, RIP, but they were a good company at the time. Alonia, like these companies that are actively getting close to like commercialization of bioindustrial products. So like a very big win for us in that space. We also have process innovators. So like, it's not enough to make a strain that makes a molecule that you care about, right? That's not enough. You also need to produce it in large quantities. And the way that we biomanufacture, like the last time you went to a brewery, I should say, and you could tour, like that is what biomanufacturing looks like. It is a steel tank, and you grow a bunch of cells, and then you harvest the cells, and then you have to spin them down and do other stuff to break the cells. But it's not a sector that has been innovated on extensively in decades. And also like there's been a little bit of innovation, I guess I should say, but really just for therapeutics. Like there's like disposable bag liners for bio reactors that companies that make cell and gene therapies use. It's way easier because you get way less contamination, but only therapeutic companies can afford them. It's too expensive. lastly, like the last thing that we saw when we went on this big tour of the state and thinking about what the needs look like, is that there's a lack of shared infrastructure. So shared infrastructure is really important for startups. Like it does not make sense. It's not efficient for startups to use capital to buy equipment that like every startup is going to need at some point. So like, can you centralize equipment? Like the engine, you know, a great incubator has all kinds of shared equipment. Greentown Labs has like, they should not be buying lathes. They should not be buying laser cutters. Like there's basic stuff that if you're like in the manufacturing arena, you don't need to buy that. But in the bioindustrial space, there really wasn't this kind of shared infrastructure, and the ones that existed were cumbersome and they were priced for therapeutic biotech companies. So there wasn't really happening in mass. Okay, so we took that, those were our conclusions about like, what does this landscape look like? What do we need? And we decided to go after federal money. So the Economic Development Agency, or EDA, had a Tech Hubs program that was funded from CHIPS dollars to establish a bioindustrial hub in central Massachusetts. So, you know, out near Worcester, like the cost of land and of living and labor is much cheaper than Greater Boston. And there's just much more land to develop. Like doing biomanufacturing in Cambridge would be nuts. I would argue like there is no land here. So that doesn't make sense, but like an hour from Boston, where it's still drivable to your R&D center, like that actually can make a lot of sense. And there's a lot of need, much more economic need there than there is in Cambridge. And so we were like, okay, great. We think we have a great use case. We were excited about it. Shocker, we didn't get the money in October. You know, this isn't a shocker because there were hundreds of applications to this. Massachusetts has, like, we're pretty lucky as a state. We have a pretty good tax base here. We have a lot of resources already existing, and we've done very well with tech. So the feds are like they don't want to fund us all the time, right? Which makes sense as an American, I get that. But so we looked at those conclusions that we've drawn about like, what does this ecosystem need and how can we achieve the same goals, even though we didn't get this money that we would have loved to get from the feds. I think one lesson that's been really useful for me to learn is in state government, but I think the same is true federally, like new money is hard. New streams of money, you got to ask a lot of people to be like, create this new pie for me that is going to meet exactly my need. That takes a lot of lobbying. But existing programs, like you can often pivot, you can make small changes to and see where you can reapply them. So we thought about it, looked at this program, M2I2. This has been around for 10 years, stands for Massachusetts Manufacturing Innovation Initiative, but this is a capital grant program for hard tech innovators to do pilot scale manufacturing. We had a lot of really good success with it over the last 10 years, like in other spaces, like big investments in materials and like electrochemical systems and additive manufacturing. Like we'd seen really good success, but we had never tried to apply it to bioindustrials. So, you know, we thought about, okay, look, can we think about what kind of investment wouldn't have the biggest impact? And so for state government, things take a while. We have a lot of approval bodies, but after like the big gap there, October 2023, but finally, like I went to the ecosystem and like honestly begged people to apply to this grant because they'd never heard of it, and they'd never heard of this agency, and it's hilarious. Like I have learned how common it is. Any state agency, any federal agency that gives out money, it can be hard to give away money. Like it actually is, because you need them to do work. You need them to like not just do any project that they might want to do under the sun. They need to work with you about like what you need and what they need, right? And also like people, like founders, they're like, I'll get around to this later, right? And that's like a super common notion. And then when they have the money, it's even hard to have the award. It's hard to get them to spend the money, but that's a different story. But but so this took time out in the ecosystem. But our first investment in this space is in a company called Cersei. Cersei's MIT, right? I think of theirs right now. Or no, she's Harvard, sorry. But this company makes fats using microbes. And so for the non-biologists, microbes are usually either aerobic, they consume oxygen, or they're anaerobic, they really hate oxygen. The former, the microbes that use oxygen are much easier to work with because there's oxygen everywhere, right? And in our laboratories, in our fermentation tanks, like it's a pretty oxygen-rich environment. But There are other types of bacteria that we can work with that do not consume that don't like oxygen, but that can make different things. Bats are hard to make in microbes. It's really hard to make. And so huge deal that Shannon figured out and her team figured out, okay, like if we make a completely new kind of reactor, a gas fermentation reactor, then we could make this happen. And their first products are palm oil replacements. If you know anything about palm oil, like ruining the entire world, and it's bad for your health.
We
and
had
so
C16 Bio present
yes,
last fall.
that's awesome. Thing. Yeah, exactly. C16 is great too. And so like this investment was interesting because they actually, if any of you like C16 or others, like want to leverage their system, they're willing to like make their pilot system available to others in the ecosystem for like a very reasonable fee. So this is a centralized facility housed at a company, which is the kind of thing the state likes to do all the time. So, okay, so that was our first investment in this space. And then since then, it's been much easier to like get people to talk to me about giving them money. The second investment we announced a couple of months ago, we put $2.1 million into Tufts. So cellular agriculture, this is like primarily this is describing growing mammalian cells, like cells from cows or cells from chicken or egg cells or whatever, in like a petri dish type of environment in a reactor. So that you can have meat substitutes that are like actually made of meat. Like Impossible is a soy patty that they add a heme to. Like heme is the thing that makes your blood red. And so like they figured out how to make heme in E. coli instead of in mammalian cell. So they added it in as an additive. Like cell ag is like actually cow meat that you are eating that was not produced by killing a cow. So this is a really like fledgling field in the bioindustrial space. But Tufts is really the leader here. David Kaplan, who's on the agenda. Yeah, you'll hear all about this space. He better mention this investment or I'll be mad at him. But this was a $2.1 million investment in a pilot scale facility that has a test kitchen. It has upstream and downstream processing equipment because it's really hard to like, you got to grow the cells and then you got to make them into like chicken nuggets. And then you have to make sure they taste okay. And if you've done a lot of like plant alternative tastings, like I have, like it's a mixed bag, right? It's not amazing. So you really got to get it in the kitchen as soon as possible. So yeah, so I think that was kind of our experience so far with the state, and there's more investments that are not announced yet, but that are in this space too. And this was kind of how we felt like we could rally to, this is what the feds want, which means like there's more opportunities on the road for us to get federal support, federal funding for it, but we got to at least initially do it in Massachusetts, maybe for several years, given this administration is not so into spending money, but you know, this was kind of how we could respond as a state. Okay, so lastly, my shortest section, local. So I have not worked at the local level, so this is like this will be a much shorter section, but I do think it's been interesting for me to see how municipalities responded to state action and to federal action. Okay, so how many people in this room are from Massachusetts? Okay, Mark. Okay, so this is in Boston. This is what always happens. All you smart people move here for MIT or Harvard or like great jobs. All right, and then most of you probably like have not gone outside of the city. You want to tell me I'm wrong? Maybe if you like hiking, you're like up there. But driving through Massachusetts, what I like to tell MIT and others is that there are 351 towns and cities in Massachusetts, and we're not all the same as Boston, or like it's not Boston in the woods, is what I should say. It is actually like a pretty. There's a lot of variety in these places. This is medium household income that I pulled it just to again make a point. So this is Cambridge, 167,000 per household. This is Holyoke, 51,000. This is medium, it's not mean. So this is not being meaningfully pulled away from the outliers that are super rich. Like this is a meaningful difference in the day-to-day earnings of these populations. This is Falmouth in the Cape. People think the Cape's all rich. It's not. There's a lot of blue collar workers here, 57K. So why do I bring this up? All right, how do municipalities think about the bioeconomy? I mean, they're not as excited as I am about it, but they do want local tax base, right? And they don't care what their neighbor town is getting. That doesn't benefit them, or at least 2 towns away doesn't benefit them. It matters who is in their local tax base, right? Like where are they getting actual tax dollars from? They also care about jobs, not in the state, not in the country, but in their town, right? Like that is meaningfully different for local authorities. I mean, they care about their neighbors, but like this is what their main focus is. Permitting and site selection. Like one thing that's been kind of fun to see is like these towns and fire departments and mayors are like I don't really like know how to have biomanufacturing in my facility. I don't know what in my town. I don't know what these companies need. And you know, what companies often say is like we're taking years to make these facilities ready. It's taking years to work with the fire departments to get permits. And so we got to make that easier so that these companies are drawn here. And then last and certainly not least, they want state dollars and they want federal dollars to specifically go to their town. And so they have to figure out how to compete. So a couple of behaviors that I've witnessed that I thought were pretty interesting. Worcester, so again, here, has really risen to the occasion about identifying biomanufacturing as an area where they can uniquely thrive. An hour from Boston, an hour from Amherst, Springfield, where there's like UMass Amherst and other research happening. But cheaper land, cheaper labor, and there already is a decent biomanufacturing base, but they want to really lean in, and especially into bioindustrial. So they have this whole plan around like streamlining the site selection, getting designations to really attract folks to the area, coordinating on different workforce programs to make sure the workforce of Worcester is really ready. And then second, like relatedly, I'll say MassBio is a lobbying group. They have thousands of members of companies that and they lobby the state, they lobby the feds, but they actually have done this tool that I think is really useful for municipalities of making a standard for like how should you get ready for this sector. If you want these companies to come here, these are the things that you should do, and we're going to grade you on a scale of how ready you are if you walk through that process. And there's different colors for different scales, but they, you know, they help municipalities figure out what's needed for them, and then they give this to industry, and industry's like, okay, I'm gonna go to, you know, a blue site, not a red site, right? Because that's gonna be easier. It's a less uphill battle. Lastly, this is actually out of my agency, but from a different part of like not my division. Our Innovation Institute has created a Tech Hubs program. If you remember, EDA Tech Hubs is our Massachusetts version, but it's a place-based initiative to designate hubs within the state, within those 351 municipalities, and invest in local infrastructure up to $5 million per town, which is like it's pretty sizable investment that can buy a lot of fermentation tanks. So it's been fun to watch these municipalities kind of rally around this. Okay, that's it. I'm happy to answer questions.
I think this is really cool talk. I wanted to ask, I guess, bringing in private capital as well, and like what you're thinking about that. My understanding is that you're no longer time frame for benefit commercialization than like VCs might be a challenge for everything.
Yeah, it is. It is. So I think for those online, the question is about like balancing this with private capital, because VCs don't, you know, it can be hard to bring VCs into like long ventures, and like that's like fundamentally the challenge with hard tech, deep tech, is it takes a long time and you need specific kinds of investors. That's why like the engine exists in the way it does. Like they're focused on very long term, but they get to do that because they're part of MIT, right? But I think I wish I had a graph of this, but a common phrase that you'll hear in the funding landscape is the valley of death, where there's a lot of money at the beginning. Actually, like VCs don't mind like being part of like a Series A or a C round, where they can get, you know, hundreds of thousands or like low millions of dollars. Can go a long way. They can pay a tiny company can pay a bunch of people in their early 20s poorly, but they're excited about it, and they can do a lot of really good work for the first 2 years, show traction, see if there's really legs to the idea. But then, okay, there's legs to the idea. You have like a prototype. You need to start making more of that prototype and getting it to your hands to the customers. Like that, what's needed there is actually usually capital dollars, not operating dollars. Operating dollars pay your people. Capital gets you equipment, makes infrastructure investments, you know, builds a new building. Like VC hates that stuff. VC doesn't, they're not a fan. And so it can be really hard to acquire funding in that phase, but you can't, like the VCs like it once, okay, you have 5 customers that like your product, and if you can scale up and they're going to buy a bunch, VC's like happy to chip in that, right? So how do you cross that valley of death? Fundamentally an issue. I think that what my team has tried to do is our dollars are specifically capital dollars. We like can only buy equipment. It's the opposite. Because part of this is because actually, if businesses go out of business after we've given them money, we've bought them equipment, we get the equipment back so that we can give it to somebody else in the state. If if we were just paying their staff, if they went out of business, that's nothing we can get back. So we actually have like the opposite incentives on my team. And so we try to make it complementary, where the M2I2 grant program I mentioned, it's capital equipment at the pilot stage. And so like the demand is so high for that program, because I meet founders, I literally meet with a founder a day on average, like who are like, I can't get private funding for this exact type of work. So, but getting the M2I2 funding, then they publish it and it helps them get more fundraising down the road. So I think that it's like, I'd love to say that we have like other methods of co-investment at the same time, but I think right now what it looks like is there's just like complementary interests, and it's about timing and type of investment.
That was a really fun talk. So I guess I had a couple questions. One pertains to centralized versus distributed manufacturing.
Yeah.
And so I always give the example of like how the printing press was this incredible way of centralized printing of newspapers that served hundreds of thousands of people. But then the dot matrix printer was invented, and all of a sudden everyone could print in their own living room.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just my first question is for biomanufacturing, where we're like very centered on this large vat that we use to brew beer, and sort of that model of centralized production. How do you view basic science potentially interfacing with technology development to disrupt that ecosystem to a point where we may see the entry of just radically new ways of producing with biology that may be in my basement?
Yeah.
It's just something I think
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. There's a Israeli startup I saw the other day. It's got funded. They just engineered potatoes to produce basically chicken white egg protein.
Yeah.
Lysine in potatoes.
Yeah.
So you can now think of producing the #1 protein additive to many households in your basement through growing potatoes hydroponically or whatever it is. But that's obviously using agriculture, but still,
Yeah.
it's a parallel where you don't need to grow chickens on some farm somewhere or even in your backyard.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really good question. I think, I would love a future where there is distributed biomanufacturing infrastructure, because it could like democratize access. And
Right.
people talk about this with like vaccine production, and like this is talked about a lot during COVID, like developing nations are like not going to get their fair share of vaccines until they can produce it domestically, right? Like that is just like not how human nature works, unfortunately, for us to like actually make it equal until they can produce it. And like, if there's a smaller capital investment because they're doing it at a smaller scale, like maybe that's more feasible. I think that's possible. I think more distributed biomanufacturing, I think we've seen in cell and gene therapies, because like you need less of those products, especially because they can be curative. So like it's not a small molecule that you have to take every day for the rest of your life. And so like the small and they're more specialized, right? And the quality control is so sensitive that it makes sense to do smaller scale, right? And so I could see a future where like in that space, slightly more distributed makes sense. But I think, I think for me, with like bioindustrials, a fundamental challenge is that the tech transfer is really hard to your biomanufacturer, right? And that's such a common point of failure. Like you have a benchtop bioreactor, you have a pilot scale bioreactor like this big, right? And that's working really, really well. But then you have to 10x it to the next scale. It will always fall apart. And then you can try to build it back together, and you might be able to get a new process that works well. But like it is so hard that in biology is so like finicky and mysterious. I would argue that like it is every time you do that, it's hard. And so I think the advantage of centralized is that you don't have to do a tech transfer with a new team in like 1,000 sites. You have to do it once, right? Or twice. But I think maybe if we make bio more, maybe if Ginkgo's vision is real, like they want to make biology like into engineering, like if that becomes real, where tech transfer isn't as hard, we understand enough about cells that like it's easier. Like I could see that. But I think it also depends on the product type. Like if it's I like making something in your basement, beer works well. I could see other foods working well, actually. Like that's like the quality control doesn't have to be as perfect, because like I don't know, if you give yourself like a small amount of food poisoning, like you'll be fine. It's not like a mass production issue, right? Or like beer, like people make their own beer and sometimes they make themselves like a little bit sick because they got it wrong, right? It's not like killing the masses. So I think that's like, I think it depends on the type of product. I think nearer term I could see like foods maybe being more locally distributed, but I would love it for more kinds of products.
You talked about like limited innovation on the bioprocess side. How does that sort of square with sort of like having manufacturing that is like interoperable? Like if you're gonna take back this like highly specialized turn.
Yeah.
Are there other companies that would use it or?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
Because I do think that like market consolidation is helpful for investors, for the government, for industry within bio manufacturing. I think like my best case scenario is that there's like a few types of biomanufacturers that biomanufacturing tech, right, tanks. And that is not infinite, because you're totally right that like we do not want to buy equipment for a central facility that is like not going to jive if someone moved from a different state here, right? And so I totally get you. I think that like a pluropoly is maybe what I'm hoping for here. But or at least like of the maybe not of the number of companies, but of the, like the actual underlying tech.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.